Coming up, the story of a provocative top 5 smash created by a daredevil supergroup that challenged the gatekeepers of commercial radio conservatism, and they wound up being sued for violation of copyright laws. There's a whole lot of yearning and a whole lot of schooling. It's coming up next on Professor of Rock. Hey, music junkies, Professor of Rock, always here to celebrate the greatest artists and the greatest songs of all time. You know, if you've ever drawn your favorite band's names or logos on your tablet or your Trapper Keeper or the desk where you went to school, you're going to love this channel. Make sure that you subscribe below right now to be a part of our Music History Daily. Interviews, stories, videos straight from the artists. You can also become an honorary producer on Patreon, our Patreon, by clicking on the link in the description. You can also see our new merch there as well, including our Vintage Years collection. One of the artists has something to do with our story today. And make sure to get your tickets for Professor of Rock Live. It's our exclusive live event with a legend. The link is below. So it's time for another edition of our series, Number One in Our Hearts. This is where we celebrate a song that was so impactful, so fantastic that it should have been a number 1 hit on the Billboard Hot 100. So today we look at what a lot of people believe is the greatest rock and roll band ever. And they never had a number 1 hit. The song that we're covering today was the closest that they ever got. Rolling Stone writer Steve Pond called Led Zeppelin the last band of the 60s and the first band of the 70s. So great. Zeppelin was truly the band that captivated a new generation of fans that were not members of the personality cult of the 60s. Critics did not like them then, but an emerging culture of uninhibited young fans, they grabbed onto Led Zeppelin immediately. It was a new age of fans, captivated by provocative music and a path of life they could call their very own. The song that characterized the approaching individualism of the 70s was released in November of 1969. Led Zeppelin's A Whole Lot of Love. In the early 60s, while most of his peers were busy groaning about acne and finding the right turtleneck, the great Jimmy Page worked tirelessly to become one of England's most sought-after session players by the time he was just 18 years old. He was known as Little Jim P, to avoid confusion with another highly used studio musician named Big Jim Sullivan. If an artist needed a guitarist back then, they either went to Little Jim or Big Jim back in those days. As the decade rolled along, though, Page was featured on a variety of notable recordings by the likes of Marianne Faithfull, Jonathan King, Brenda Lee, Van Morrison, the Kinks, even The Who. Jimmy provided rhythm guitar licks for The Who on their first single, I Can't Explain. In 1966, Page got the idea of assembling a supergroup with Keith Moon and John Entwistle from The Who and Jeff Beck and John Paul Jones. When the guys talked about how they thought that the supergroup would be received, Keith Moon shot back that the group would go over like a Led Zeppelin. In other words, it'd be a disaster in his mind. Now, I should note, however, that some say that quip actually came from Entwistle. Regardless, the joking remark, that stuck with Jimmy Page, and he would bring it to the forefront a few years later. Now, late in 1966, Jimmy Page replaced bassist Paul Samwell Smith and joined his buddy Jeff Beck as one of the Yardbirds. Less than 2 years later, Jeff Beck too departed, and despite frantic efforts to keep that band together, the Yardbirds imploded. Jimmy Page went back to his idea of forming a supergroup that shared the same musical vision and the tenacity to bust the status quo. Jimmy reconnected with John Paul Jones, and then he went on full pursuit for a lead vocalist. Now, he instantly thought of Steve Marriott from Small Faces and Terry Reid. Neither were available, but Reid gave Page a recommendation to check out an unknown singer named Robert Plant. Page found Robert Plant performing at a teacher's college in Birmingham, England, of all places, and he couldn't believe what he heard. Plant belted out an unsettling version of Jefferson Airplane's Somebody to Love that Jimmy Page called a primitive wail. Needless to say, Jimmy was awestruck and straight away invited Robert to be the front man for his new band. Now, the last piece of the puzzle was, of course, bringing in an amazing drummer. At Plant's insistence, the guys zeroed in on a fierce musician named John Bonham. He played with Plant in a group named Band of Joy. What they got with Bonham was more than someone that simply provided a backbeat. They got a killer that delivered a crushing attack every time that he hit the stage. Bonzo, as he was nicknamed, became synonymous with a drum set the same way that Jimi Hendrix, Eddie Van Halen, or Jimmy Page, for that matter, became synonymous with a guitar. Page, Plant, Jones, and Bonham were first called the New Yardbirds, but that was just kind of a placeholder to hide their future identity. Now, as we continue to break this song down and the band, I want to thank our sponsor, Zenni Eyewear. They're the frames that I always wear. One of the best features at Zenni.com that you'll find, you can go design your own pair of glasses online, but you can immediately then see exactly how you look before you buy. It's called Zenni's Mirror Feature. Check it out today at Zenni.com. So Jimmy Page reflected on the go over like a Led Zeppelin comment that we talked about before, and he decided to change the name of the band to Led Zeppelin. Changing the spelling on lead, L-E-A-D, so that people didn't get confused and mispronounce them as Lead Zeppelin. The name Led Zeppelin is meant to symbolize the contrast between simplicity and complexity. He didn't want to unveil the name of the band until the first album was released, though. Even on the covers of the first recordings, the box read New Yardbirds, not Led Zeppelin. Led Zeppelin's eponymous debut LP with George Hardy's iconic cover of the Hindenburg Disaster, that was released in 1969 to tremendous success. It rose to number 6 in the UK, and it went to number 10 in the US album chart, where it sold over 8 million units. And one of the biggest keys to the success of Led Zeppelin was the way the 4 band members naturally came together as an artistic unit. Their influences intersected with a mutual passion for American blues and jazz, and a shared desire to make records that were a complete musical experience for the listener. Now, for their second studio album, Led Zeppelin II, the production reins went solely to Jimmy Page, while the engineer role went to Eddie Kramer. Page envisioned a heavier experimental sound for their second album because he had complete control of the production of Zeppelin II. The recording studio effectively turned into a laboratory of mashups for Dr. Page. For the first cut on the album that developed into a Whole Lotta Love, Page had a complicated arrangement in his head, used a variety of innovative production techniques. It's very interesting. Page kicked off Whole Lotta Love with a loose blues riff for the intro, playing a Sunburst 1958 Les Paul Standard through a 100-watt Marshall Plexi head amp with distortion from EL34 output values. A monster jam Page conceived on his houseboat on the River Thames that is held as one of the greatest riffs of all time. In 2014, in fact, listeners of BBC Radio 2 voted Page's riff on Whole Lotta Love as the greatest, with Slash's riff on Sweet Child of Mine coming in at second place. Total Guitar and Guitar World also named the Whole Lotta Love riff as the best in their respective polls. Respect from contemporary guitar slingers like Jack White and The Edge, who call it the greatest riff, probably mean more to Page than any other praise, really. The section of Whole Lotta Love where Page really went wild with experimentation was in the so-called Freak Out. That begins around the 1 minute and 18-second mark. The Freak Out is submerged in atmospheric swirls, feedback-laden bends, growls, and reverse echo with strange high-pitched effects that later included primitive shrills from the throat of Robert Plant. The secret ingredient that generated those erotic swirls in the midsection was the theremin. Of course, a mysterious instrument mostly used in horror films, thrillers of the 40s and 50s. The theremin was the brainchild of Soviet inventor Leon Theremin in 1919. Perhaps the most famous use of the theremin in popular music was in the Beach Boys' classic Good Vibrations. In fact, in my interview with Brian Wilson, he talked a little bit about it.
The theremin, previously only used in
movies, right?
Scary
Hitchcock
movies and stuff like that. So it was a really brilliant choice.
What brought about that?
That was my brother Carl's idea. He said, why don't we use a theremin, a real spooky theremin? I said, sure.
It's a really mystical sounding instrument.
And the cellos, using it as a rhythm section.
Right. So I made up diddly, 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 that kind of thing. Yeah, really, really cool.
Now, Page would occasionally use a scaled-down version of the theremin known as the sonic wave during live performances with the Yardbirds. After seeing the way that Randy California from the band Spirit mounted the device on the top of his amplifier. However, for the arrangement of Whole Lotta Love, Jimmy Page used a double-stacked theremin to produce twice the sonic assault. The simulated growling came from Page radically detuning and pulling on the guitar strings simultaneously. Page called his concoction evil sounds that you're not supposed to hear on commercial radio. I love that. Reverse echo is a production technique that was pretty much invented by Jimmy Page. He originated reverse echo on the Yardbirds track 10 Little Indians in an effort to salvage what Page and the band thought was an extremely silly song with an awful brass arrangement. The reverse or backwards reverb is applied to the first word or syllable of the vocal or a musical chord for an instrumental buildup or a mystical sound. Rock bands, including Metallica, have employed the technique very well. It's also been employed in various forms of electronic dance and pop music. Eddie Kramer explained that he and Page experimented with mixing the album and left in some audio tape bleed through from an earlier vocal taken from Plant. Another original touch was using low-frequency oscillators on the tape machine to push the sound down, and then lift it back up, making it sound like the rhythm is moving, simulating body gyration. What Page and Kramer did on Whole Lotta Love had never been done before, especially smack dab in the middle of a song. It was bold, avant-garde studio production that would not have happened, really, think about it, wouldn't have happened with an outside producer, that would have interfered with every move and misunderstood what Jimmy Page was really trying to do. Now, the lyrics for Whole Lotta Love, penned by Robert Plant, were as controversial as they were provocative. Now, the original writing credits for Whole Lotta Love were listed as Jimmy Page, Robert Plant, and John Bonham. Yet there's no question that Plant had lifted some of the song lyrics from Willie Dixon's composition, You Need Love. In 1966, the Small Faces recorded the song as You Need Lovin' for their debut album.
Way down inside, woman, you need love. Way down inside, I ain't fooling, you need schooling. Baby, I'm not fooling, I'm gonna say it, yeah.
Now, according to Steve Marriott, the group's vocalist and guitarist Page and Plant attended several Small Face gigs where they expressed their interest in You Need Lovin'. When Marriott heard the Zeppelin's Whole Lotta Love, he was shocked that their song so closely resembled the bluesy Small Faces number that was co-written by Ronnie Lane and Marriott. Plant's phrasing, it's very similar to that of Marriott's if you listen. He contended that Plant sang Whole Lotta Love in the same style that he delivered on You Need Lovin'. Marriott added that even Plant's vocal stops at the end of Zeppelin's track are identical to his vocal stops in the Small Faces tune.
You You need love.
Eventually, Willie Dixon sued Led Zeppelin for plagiarizing You Need Love, and he won an out-of-court settlement. That was in 1985, an undisclosed amount. On subsequent releases, A Whole Lot of Love since 1985, Dixon's name is included on writing credits along with Plant, Page, and Bonham. Curiously, though, Small Faces' You Need Love, and again, suspiciously close to Dixon's composition, he did not sue the Small Faces for plagiarizing You Need Love. So, kind of confusing. Here's a final footnote on that subject of the Dixon lawsuit with Led Zeppelin. Dixon used the settlement money to set up a national program that provided musical instruments for public schools. Very cool touch. Led Zeppelin's enormous love for the blues, that led to their own distinctive interpretations of several blues tracks on their earlier recordings, such as Dazed and Confused by Jake Holmes.
You're out to get me, you're on the right track.
Led Zepp's remake of Dazed and Confused, placed on their first LP, that evolved into, of course, one of their signature songs.
Been dazed and confused for so long, it's not true.
Then there's Zeppelin's reworking of Howling Wolf's The Lemon Song. That was on Zeppelin 2.
I wouldn't be here tonight, down on the killing floor. Every time I go away, I'll leave you, darling. Send me the-
Paying tribute to the music that deeply inspired the four members of Led Zeppelin. The band used Whole Lot of Love as the basis for a homage medley that they performed during their live concert sets on their last two rounds of touring before the breakup of the band following Bonham's death that sadly happened in 1980. The band incorporated some of their favorite blues songs in those medleys, mixed with snippets of their own material. Blues classics like Boogie Chillin' by John Lee Hooker, Let's Have a Party by Wanda Jackson, and Boogie Woogie songs by Leadbelly.
Boogie Chillin'.
Undoubtedly, Led Zeppelin may never have become a band at all if it weren't for their heroes, blues and jazz. For Jimmy Page, it was the music of Leadbelly, Robert Johnson, and McKinley Morganfield, better known as Muddy Waters. Those were his biggest influences, along with Lonnie Donegan's Skiffle and Elvis, the King. Plant, too, greatly admired Robert Johnson and Elvis, as well as Booka White and Skip James, among many others. John Paul Jones loved blues singer and guitarist Big Bill Brunzi, and the jazz of Charles Mingus. It was Chicago jazz musician Phil Upchurch that inspired his decision to even become a bassist. Bonzo Bonham fashioned his playing style after the crazy animated style of Gene Krupa. Of course, he idolized Ginger Baker, whom he regarded as the best drummer of all time. Led Zeppelin didn't issue singles in the UK because it was considered gauche. It did hit number 21 later on because of digital downloads in the UK, but in the United States, Atlantic Records had to play the singles game. Whole Lot of Love was the one and only single from Led Zeppelin 2. Zeppelin was always an albums band, much like Pink Floyd. The label made a radio edit, and it chopped the song in half. But after listening to the edit just one time, Jimmy Page immediately squashed it with extreme prejudice. Page's contempt for the edit led to the band issuing a press release stating, Led Zeppelin have no intention of issuing Whole Lot of Love as a single, as they feel it was written as part of their concept of the album. Now, true to their word, the American single is the same version that is found on Led Zeppelin 2. Despite its length of more than 5.5 minutes and its graphic lyrical content, Whole Lot of Love shockingly defied the strict conservatism of AM Top 40 radio to become Zeppelin's highest charting single on the Billboard Hot 100 ever, soaring to number 4 back in early 70. Now, back in 1969, Whole Lot of Love, when it was first released, could have easily been banned from the airwaves because of its sexual connotations and Robert Plant's howls of desire. But the popularity of Led Zeppelin was just too powerful to deny. When Whole Lot of Love hit the airwaves, it did more than Dazed and Confused, the mores of the Federal Communication Commission. It broke down the barriers of top 40 programming. It broke down the barriers of top 40 programming as the hottest song around the world. It was number 1 in Australia. It was number 1 in Germany, number 2 in Belgium, Canada, and Denmark. And it was basically top 10 in every country that calculated a weekly song survey. I mean, as soon as listeners heard Page's incredible lead riff and Plant's volcanic performance with his high-pitched shrills and spasms, there was no stopping the historic force of Whole Lotta Love or the Led Zeppelin II album. Led Zeppelin II twice knocked the Beatles' Abbey Road off of the top spot on the Billboard 200 album chart on December 27th, 1969, and it held the number 1 position for 7 weeks, eventually selling over 12 million copies. Now, when they knocked the Beatles off the top of the charts, it was a big omen. I mean, the biggest band in the universe getting knocked off their perch by the new biggest band in the world. My memory of this song, it actually comes through my dad. He told me this story many, many times when I was growing up. I'll never forget it. He said when he first heard Whole Lotta Love on the radio, he was in high school. He was sitting in his car about ready to walk into his job as a bagger at this grocery store that actually no longer exists. It was called Carl and Don's. I remember I grew up in a small town in Idaho. So he was just going to be on time. But as soon as the song started playing on the radio, he said he was paralyzed. He said he couldn't move. He'd never heard anything quite like it, ever. He was going to be late, and he said his boss was a stickler for being on time, but he had to hear this seismic song. Now, he ended up being late, but he knew that come hell or high water, he was going to get his hands on this record. So he told me that he'd heard Good Times, Bad Times before this, and he was vaguely aware of who Zeppelin was, but just didn't have the impact that Whole Lotta Love had on him, especially in that moment. And you have to remember, like I said, we lived in a small town, Blackfoot, Idaho, and we were always like 6 months to a year behind the times, especially back then, I'm sure. But he said that sometime later, probably a week or two, he got a copy of Zeppelin II. He got his hands on it. In fact, it's the very copy I have in the rack right there. He handed it down to me. Anyway, the day he bought it, he rushed home to play it on his parents' hi-fi system. And he was all by himself. And he said he listened to the album, inside and out, several times over, and he was just absolutely hypnotized by this otherworldly band. And he said that he looked at the clock a little bit later, and he realized he was late for work again. So he rushed to work, and he said his boss gave him a really hard time. He was late for a second time in a week or so. And he told me what he said to his boss. He said, it's Led Zeppelin's fault. Now, his boss had no clue what he was talking about. Who the hell is Led Zeppelin, is what he said. Well, soon enough, the whole world would know exactly who Led Zeppelin was, forevermore after.
The ring razor out in black, right on.
The 3 songs that were ahead of A Whole Lotta Love the week that it peaked at number 4 on the charts. Raindrops Keep Falling on My Head by B.J. Thomas was at number 3. Venus by the Shocking Blue was at number 2. And I Want You Back by the Jackson 5 was at number 1. Come to think of it, it was actually 52 years ago this week that happened. Whole Lotta Love ended up being Zepp's only top 10 hit. They never had a number 1. Now, in a perfect world, we could take one of the 4 weeks that Raindrops Keep Falling on My Head was tops and give Zepp their day at the top of the charts.
Raindrops are falling on my head.
Regardless, it's a bona fide number 1 in our hearts, and in no doubt about it, Mind Bomb.
I keep it coolin', baby. I keep it coolin', baby.
What do you think? Leave us a comment about Led Zeppelin and Whole Lotta Love. What are your memories of this song and this moment in music if you were alive? Times were truly changing, and there was a changing of the guard. What do you think about that? Tell us in the comments. If you like our content, make sure to subscribe to this channel so that you never miss out. We'd love to have you. Be sure to check us out on Patreon for even more content and our new merch. Make sure to get your tickets for Professor of Rock Live, our event series that's coming up as well. Help us keep the music alive. That's always the idea. Until next time, 3 chords and the truth, my friends. Stay safe.